illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came.
Issue of immigration, of illegal immigration, has been an extremely volatile one on account of large numbers of people leaving their home countries, on account of insecurity caused by war, on account of climate change, and on account of people wanting to simply improve their prospects.
Why do you think Donald Trump and the Americans are insisting on shackling people? I mean, even not allowing them to go to the washroom if these accounts are to be believed. I mean, what is the probable reason to do this?
To drive a political message, a visible message, both to their own citizens, their own persons who support such expulsion, and to the individuals who are being brought back in these circumstances, to deter and discourage others from following in there.
The passengers described the conditions of their forced return as harrowing.
Our hands and feet were cuffed. They told us we're being taken to a detention center, but they brought us to the airport instead and made us sit in a plane.
For those who are coming back as deportees, we should bear in mind that they are actually victims.
Hello and welcome to Inside South Asia with me, Amit Baruah, your host for this episode. A major controversy has erupted over the landing of 3 US military aircraft carrying illegal immigrants from India at Amritsar Airport. This is part and parcel of President Trump's global crackdown on illegal immigration into the United States. It's not as if India has been singled out, but the treatment meted out to Indian citizens returning from the US remains the same. They came on military aircraft. They were shackled, if newspaper reports and eyewitness accounts are to be believed. It is, as I said, part of a larger crackdown. Different countries have dealt with the issue differently. The president of Colombia said that he would not accept the US military flights from American soil, saying that this amounted to ill treatment of his citizens. In fact, the American planes were returned, and later, in an agreement that he reached with President Trump, Colombia sent its own military aircraft to get these citizens back. That's just by way of context. As you all know, that Indians are a large immigrant group to the United States now. The issue of illegal immigration or undocumented Indians is a serious one. And this matter was also discussed when Prime Minister Modi was in the United States. To put all this in perspective and to understand the larger drivers of immigration, not just to the United States, but globally for India, I'm delighted that we are joined by Sujata Mehta, former secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, who's dealt with a number of these issues. She's also been a member of the Union Public Services Commission, or UPSC. Welcome to Inside South Asia, Sujata. So the question that I want to pose to you is that how do you place all these issues in perspective?
Actually, there's an even broader perspective than what happened with the returnees to India from the United States. There has been a global increase in the number of people leaving their countries of origin on account of several factors over the last several decades. If we take the last 2 decades alone, the issue of immigration, of illegal immigration, has been an extremely volatile one on account of large numbers of people leaving their home countries, on account of insecurity caused by war, on account of climate change, and on account of people wanting to simply improve their prospects. Since the This is a phenomenon which has actually been around forever. But in the last 2 decades, it has become a matter of political sensitivity in the developed world in a manner that has probably not happened in the past. We in India have actually been dealing with issues arising from what we regard as illegal immigration for even longer. If we think back, that is something that was the fulcrum of the Assam Accord. So this is a problem which has global dimensions and local dimensions, and we need to bear both aspects in mind.
And what is your sense? I mean, this differential in handling the issues of returnees, say, I mentioned Colombia in my opening remarks. So, how would you see this differential in how you deal with these people? Because the president of Colombia is also on record as saying that these people have done nothing wrong. You know, they went as citizens, looking for better prospects, and he's welcomed them back. So, how would you see this differential?
Well, the thing is, there's a sovereignty issue involved here. There are two aspects to the sovereignty issue because, of course, it is for the country where persons are there without authorization to determine whether or not they want to allow them, to determine whether or not they want them to stay in the long term, and to determine whether or not they want them to leave in the circumstances that they intimate. Now, it is really then for the country which is receiving its citizens back to determine the manner in which they are to be received back. The president of Colombia decided to send an aircraft from Colombia. Apparently, in the case of India, we decided that we would let the US determine how they should return, and we allowed them to follow their standard operating procedures. In the past, too, there have been deportations. There has been an identification of the years in which deportees returned from the United States. Apparently, from what we know, this is the first instance in which they have come back in military aircraft. Presumably, they were received through commercial flights, through civilian aircraft charters. I wouldn't be able to speak to that. But the fact remains, and what I want to mention in this context is that way back in 1985, the United Nations had adopted a declaration, and I'd like to read the title to you. There's a Declaration on Human Rights of Individuals Who Are Not Nationals. And according to that, and this declaration was adopted without a vote. So the United States, India, and all other countries, members of the United Nations, were party to that. Now, this had certain elements to it. One, that the matter of the presence of alien citizens of another country is a matter of state sovereignty. That is unchallenged. However, the issue of preserving the dignity of those who are either staying outside their countries of origin or the manner of their return should not be limited in any way. So the dignity of the individual concerned was an important attribute. Similarly, the issue of the non-use of force in the treatment of such persons. These are obviously, this is a declaration and it's a best effort process. This does not in any way limit the requirement or the assumption that states must pursue their required processes in the manner they decide to, but without restricting inter alia the dignity and non-use of force on such individuals. So this is something that in fact applies, but with all other such cases, these are not absolute. These are aspects which require to be kept in the framework of what is required for a state to pursue its interests.
For instance, if an individual misbehaves on a flight, even on a civilian flight, the captain of the aircraft is well within his rights to restrain that person if required, and punitive action can be taken. So why do you think Donald Trump and the Americans are insisting on shackling people? I mean, even not allowing them to go to the washroom if these accounts are to be believed. I mean, what is the probable reason to do this?
Well, presumably there are two aspects to it. One can infer that there are two aspects. One is the need to preserve safety on board an aircraft, which is carrying back persons to a place of origin, perhaps assuming that this is an involuntary transfer. They would feel the need to preserve the safety. That's one part of it. But the other part of it is that it's also perhaps intended to drive a political message, a visible message, both to their own citizens, their own persons who support such expulsion, and to the individuals who are being brought back in these circumstances, to deter and discourage others from following in their wake. So I think there are both elements to this. Now, one can assume that if such transfers and deportations have happened in the past, safety would not have been impugned. Now, I would not be able to speak to that. So one can only infer what the reasoning would have been.
Sujata, as someone who's been in government for a long time, what is your sense? Did India have a choice really in accepting these people? Should we have sent our own aircraft to receive our citizens? What do you think should have been the course of action to be followed?
That is entirely something that could have been thought of, may have been thought of, after all, in situations of conflict where Indian citizens have been trapped. We have actually made arrangements for their safe and secure return. I mean, this dates back to the first Gulf War, when we arranged for such a large number of people to come back to safety. We arranged for people to come back from Lebanon. We've arranged for people to come back from, there have been so very many occasions and instances in which we have arranged for people to come back. At the time of the outbreak of conflict in Ukraine, then too we had set up a safe migration system. So this is something which is entirely possible. Now, I don't know whether this was discussed. I have no way of knowing that. But the fact is that if people in conflict situations have been trapped in a difficult place at a difficult time on account of events outside their control, which would have been the cases of the outbreak of war that I have mentioned, or civil conflict that I've mentioned, in a sense, this could apply in the case of the return of deportees from the United States as well. Now, I would like to make the point that it is our declared policy, and it is a correct policy, that any Indian who is outside the country without proper authorization of the country where they are, and if their nationality is verified, we are obligated to bring them back, or we are obligated to allow them to return. So there's no discussion on that. That is the crucial thing, is that if their nationality is verified, and in this case, from what we read in the press, about 18,000 such Indians are present in the United States at this time, less the number who have already come back. Now, we have also seen reports that a small number are being sent from the United States to Costa Rica, which may have been the intermediate point for their early entry into the United States. We don't know. But apparently, while awaiting verification of identity, this small group will be in Costa Rica. Perhaps there will be other such intermediate nations also where such transit will happen. But it looks like this will be an ongoing process.
So, someone who's looked at, the system closely of how these things work, and, who's worked, in various Western countries as well. You mentioned in the beginning about the political sensitivities in the Western world. how those sensitivities have changed or are changing. So is this, in the past, the developing world used to insist on something called free movement of persons. I haven't heard that terminology being used for a while. So is it your sense that while the problem of illegal immigration is clearly there, we have a large number of Indians turning up at US borders, for instance. This is something relatively new, as opposed to the issue of people overstaying their visas and so on. So obviously the issue is there, but is it your sense that now it's being used, as a political a tool to mobilize support in domestic situations, whether it's in the US or in Europe?
Entirely so. I think the fact is that the presence of a large number of persons in countries in the Western world has become a political issue in a manner which it wasn't so in the past. I mean, do you remember in the 1960s, at the time that Enoch Powell made that speech about rivers of blood?
Yes.
The issue of,
and there was quite a lot of umbrage. There was quite a lot of umbrage after
exactly.
that.
So at that stage, the resentment was even about what was regarded as legal migration, because the persons who were under discussion at the time of the Enoch Powell speech were actually East African Asians who had been expelled from East Africa and who were then entering the UK. And there were issues about the nature of their rights deriving from British origin passports, if you remember. So the issue has been around in different incarnations for a while. In Europe, it suddenly became an issue in the early 2000s after the war in Afghanistan. It then got reinforced on account of conflicts, several conflicts in the Middle East. It then got a fresh lease of life after 2011, when Libya was bombed. So there have been issues which have arisen from waves of conflict. And people have tried to then move to areas proximate to them to improve their life situation, to flee for safety, to flee for finding sanctuary. So the issue has never gone away fully, but it has developed different proportions or different reflections.
And how do you think this is going to play out? I mean, should we expect more of these barriers to not only, I mean, of course, illegal immigration is something which, as you said, sovereign countries have to tackle, but can we expect more legal barriers to immigration as a whole?
It's entirely possible. I guess it's really a question of how domestic politics operate in the countries to which people are traveling, isn't it? There would need to be a balance struck between the requirement to have people who will do jobs that citizens, residents, those legally there will not be willing to undertake. Hence the resort in so many countries to guest worker programs. At the same time, there are some situations in which people would move simply because the place where they live, life has become intolerable. If there's a climate disaster, if there's a flood, if there's an earthquake, there are natural events on account of which people are forced to move, prolonged drought. Now, there has been a large movement of people from Africa, for instance, to South Europe and Europe on account of events unfolding, both man-made and natural, which make it imperative for them to try and find another way of life. Now, some European countries have adopted the system of intercepting people in the Mediterranean Sea or intercepting people at sea to ensure that they don't actually land there. There's sort of a common European expeditionary force, there's a common European naval force in the Mediterranean which tries to block such persons seeking sanctuary in leaky boats from arriving. And then there are groups of individuals functioning as NGOs who actually try to assist such persons because they feel that they have a moral obligation to help people in this fashion. So what the point that I'm trying to make is that there's probably no single policy that is going to work on this. But that having been said, the issue of sovereignty, that it is for a country to determine, for a state to determine who should arrive, who should enter, and the manner in which they may enter, is something that has to be determined by each state. That is
one of the other points, that I'd like to discuss with you is that, from the estimates I see, as many as 61 countries are showing a decrease in population. And since 2022, and a number of these countries are in the Western world. So it's clear that people are needed to do the jobs, whether it is, working as cleaners, working at airports, doing hard jobs in hotels and so on. So there's, working in restaurants. A large number of jobs are being done by so-called illegals. So in a situation where these countries are actually facing a decline in population, do you think it's fair to put up such barriers even to legal immigration?
The issue of determining what is fair would actually be one where perhaps in which every individual could come to a different conclusion or may come to at least dissimilar conclusions. Even looking at this matter from a practical perspective, it is clear what you're saying, that there are jobs that need to be done. Nationals frequently don't want to do them. And for others who are looking for improving their economic prospects, either for themselves or for their families back home, the possibility of finding such employment is a huge incentive to go. No question of that. And what you're saying, that there are positions, there are jobs in the blue-collar sector which in many instances nationals do not want to undertake. Agriculture, you haven't mentioned agriculture. I mean, they say that a lot of agriculture in the Western world, the United States, also in Europe, is dependent on foreign labor. In most cases, it may be documented persons. There may be a lot of cases in which they're undocumented persons. I mean, we read in the press that there are estimates that whether it is California, whether it is other places in the United States, they need workers who may be documented, ideally, or undocumented. Because they are saying that, for instance, there will not be enough persons to pick oranges in Florida if undocumented workers are kept out, or oranges in California, whatever. I mean, but this is a very real issue. So then the solution that some suggest is that countries should develop guest worker programs. Now, developing guest worker programs requires a legislative arrangement. It requires a mobility arrangement. I mean, these are issues which do require attention.
For instance, again, the figures that I've been seeing, as far as Indian nationals are concerned, the three largest countries in which Indian immigrants are living are currently the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. So the latter two clearly do have guest worker programs. Singapore has a large guest worker program from which people from Indian origin go. So what is it that prevents, many of these Western countries from having similar programs in place?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at where Indians are outside India, approximately, I believe the figure is in the region of 50% for West Asia and the Gulf. And 20 to 25% in the United States, the largest in North America, the largest in North America being in Canada, and the second largest being in the United States. Now, you would have seen that estimates of undocumented Indians in the United States range between about 220,000 to 700,000. Now, the reason why there's such a broad band is because of the manner in which different sources of these figures have derived these estimates. I believe the last estimate from the US government is in the region of 220,000 undocumented Indians, of whom, as we have read recently, 18,000 or so have been verified by India as being Indian nationals. So the point I'm trying to make is that the numbers we're looking at are across a very broad range. It is again for the recipient country to determine how they want to develop ways of receiving individuals for purposes of labor and employment. It is not really for the country of origin to determine how they should go. So such programs or such frameworks have clearly been developed better in the Gulf, from what we say, because if 50% are from the Gulf, there's one other interesting aspect I want to mention here, and that is that the system of remittances from the Gulf shows that much more money comes from Indian workers in the Gulf than, in fact, from the Western world. What we know is that approximately 70% of the remittances come from individuals who are in the Gulf and West Asia, and only about 20% comes from the Western world, which leads one to infer that persons who go to the developed countries actually develop roots and try and establish themselves for the longer term than persons who go for employment in the Gulf and West Asia. That is also to do with the manner in which nationality naturalization arrangements have been developed. So it's a very complex set of issues. But I think we need to understand the layers of complexity that are involved in this.
Sujata, one word that I didn't mention, which I would like to pose to you in terms of a broader approach, is the R word, which is the question of race. I mean, are we now too content? Because, so far, I think a lot of the people living in the developing world, have been pussyfooting around this issue. But people in the West are no longer pussyfooting around it, because if you see the rise of right-wing parties in Europe, in America, the kind of language that is being openly used is there for everybody to see and is being widely reported. So is it that we are going to see a migration or an immigration regime internationally, which is going to be determined by race?
Well, I would hazard a guess that an international regime which would be established on the basis of race is extremely unlikely. I mean, I don't think any set of states would want to or be part of discussions which would determine race as even a component of such an arrangement. No, let me come to it. No, the point that I'm trying to make is that the issue of race is one that is salient in or implicit in domestic politics. It is in a sense shrouded in the whole debate in countries, within countries, on multiculturalism versus assimilation versus or multiculturalism versus integration. Should countries have a major ethnicity at their base, Or should multiple ethnicities exist or coexist in a nation? And each country, I think, is undergoing a domestic debate on this. And they're trying to determine whether diasporas belong there as a distinct subgroup or whether they should assimilate. Now, the United States has actually been almost an outlier in this, in the sense that people identify themselves by their country of origin along with their identity as Americans. I mean, you hear people saying, I'm Irish American, I'm Israeli American, I'm Indian American, I'm Chinese American, and it is regarded as being a function of being American. Now, there are other societies where, in fact, mention of their race or their ethnicity is secondary to their nationality. So that brings up issues of how citizenship is derived. So let's not go into that. But suffice it to say that issues of domestic politics and political mobilization within countries is what is defining how matters of immigration or forced immigration or voluntary immigration are considered.
Because looking at the kind of unilateralism that at least we are hearing about now, maybe it will be implemented, especially on tariffs and, unraveling some of the international treaties that have taken years of negotiation, and the stress that the Western world at one time lay on the WTO and all these seem to be unraveling. And, these issues of the right to be able to migrate, to live, to work, depending on the criteria that you meet. I mean, this seems to be a shrinking opportunity in a sense.
Well, let me begin by saying that I don't know whether any of us have a right to migrate. There are some cases in which migration becomes inescapable because there are natural events that force individuals to leave. I mean, a situation in which a country is facing devastation on account of a natural cause. I mean, think of it. When we hear about sea level rise, and there are instances where coasts may be washed away. I mean, it's possible that we may actually face climate refugees in the not too distant future. So there, I think people would have a right to leave and others would have an obligation to receive. I think these are issues that we need to discuss and reflect on further. But at this point in time, I don't know whether anyone has a right to migrate to a particular destination. But the issue of mobility, the issue of mobility that you mentioned is an absolute one. And this is something that was implicit in even discussions on trade when we talk of movement of natural persons. This is exactly what we mean, that there are jobs to be done and the persons who could undertake those jobs are elsewhere. So let us determine if there's a way to ensure that the process is safe and orderly. And that is really the question that we need to discuss. And again, it is for countries where people are coming into work who need to determine whether and in what manner people should be admitted to their borders to undertake these jobs. I mean, there were studies done some years ago that the largest number of working positions that would arise would be in agriculture, in services, and actually for the care of the elderly. And this is something which will arise in the Western developed world in particular. And they need to find ways to identify who can come and perform these jobs and where they should come from and how they should come.
Well, I think, Sujata Mehta, you've given us quite a wide, we've discussed a wide array of issues, but I do want to pick up, as we end on what you said about Bangladesh, India's experience of illegal immigration with Bangladesh. This is something of an issue, and now we see we've seen in the last couple of days Pakistan announcing that it wants to send back 3 million Afghan refugees from its territory. It's a huge exercise that is being going to be conducted. They have been sending people back, but this is massive. And as you said, war, displacement. We'll have to wait and see, how that world responds to the litmus tests of those in those situations, because inward-looking political, political approaches can also spell disaster for, as you said, for climate refugees. So I think we need to talk more about this issue. But for this episode, I think we'll have to leave it here. You have any final comments? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to say I agree entirely with you that these are issues which need more and deeper reflection. But the one point I'd like to leave you with is that India is, in a sense, in a unique place, because we're a country from which people emigrate. A lot of people leave our borders legally and perhaps in less than legal circumstances, but we are also a recipient country. So we have a large number of people who come here. The last thought I would like to leave is that for those who are coming back as deportees, we should bear in mind that they are actually victims. They are victims in at least 2 to 3 ways, because they are persons who've been forced to leave because they're looking for employment, they're looking for ways of bettering their prospects, and they are being treated, they are having to face the rigor of a legal system which is not their own, and in a situation where they have possibly been trafficked. So they have been under the control of individuals who are actually profiting from their movement. So I think we need to be sensitive to their situation and to the difficulties that they have endured.
Well, as we know that immigration, migration, legal or illegal, is a very tough job. And obviously a lot of these people are victims. But interestingly, we see that some of these people who have been sent back are from some of the richer states of India. Well, we leave that debate, as I said, for another day. Thank you so much, Sujata Mehta, for discussing on Inside South Asia, what the issue of immigration means, not just for India, for the rest of the region, for the world. And I think this is an issue which we will have to keep coming back to. Thank you so much for talking to us, Sujata.
Thank you.